Welcome back to Tell You Story Alaska. Today we will be covering Barrow, Alaska and Beaver, Alaska. But I have to be careful because Barrow is actually Utqiagvik. They changed the name recently. But still, when I talk to people, they still refer to it as Barrow. But if you look at a map, it does say Utqiagvik, the Inupiaq name for the village, which was changed recently, and we will get into all of that. There was quite a lot in preparing for this because Barrow is a very prominent town in Alaska. There is a lot to say about it, so I'll probably end up spending a lot more time talking about Barrow or Utqiagvik. Because of the history that's there. It's the oil that's there nowadays makes it an economic powerhouse for the state, and there's a lot of interesting stories that come out of there. I narrowed it down to hopefully a concise history of the town. And after that, we will cover Beaver, Alaska, a very, very small village along the Yukon River. All right, let's dive right in. Barrow, Alaska, or Utqiagvik, Alaska. Barrow is the northernmost community in North America. So when I read that, it means that it's farther north than even any Canadian community. I didn't confirm this, but if it's the northernmost in North America, that means Canada's part of that. So it's at 71 degrees north latitude, which is quite far up there. Now, for perspective, the equator is 0 degrees latitude, and North Pole is 90 degrees. And so Barrow is at 71. But still, Barrow is still over 1,000, actually 1,100 nautical miles from the North Pole. I was able to check that with ForeFlight. And so it's still quite far from the North Pole. That's why many of the North Pole expeditions, you might think Alaska would be a good place to depart for these, but it's not. There's places much closer to the North Pole than Barrow, Alaska. But yet Barrow is the most northerly in the Northern American continent as far as a community. I went out down a rabbit hole. I probably wasted time. But the first flight over the North Pole was by Richard E. Byrd, but it's controversial because the records he kept, some people question whether he actually flew over the pole. But he did not depart from Alaska, which you might think. He departed from an island north of Norway because it's much, much closer. But anyway, it is pretty far north nonetheless. Now, as a side note, and it being so close to Christmas, and this being the northernmost village in North America, it's worth mentioning that its proximity to North Pole and about Santa Claus. We've been talking about Santa with our kids. Now, we tell our kids that Santa Claus was a man named Saint Nicholas of Myra, who was a follower of Jesus, and he lived in the 300s AD, and this is who Santa Claus actually is. Saint Nicholas attended the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. He's known for saving some girls from some horrible harm. He was also known for his kindness to children. And today we tell our kids that's who he really was. But it's fun to pretend that he still goes around giving gifts to children and he lives at the North Pole. So we're explaining this to our kids, and my kids love the legend of Santa. And so my son, who loves maps, and he's a lot like me, he loves to research things. He said he wanted to see the North Pole on Google Earth to see what was there. He's like, let's see. I said, okay. So we pulled out Google Earth. We zoomed into the North Pole. And before we looked there, my wife and I began to debate, is there ice up there? Like, could Santa actually have, a home there? Is there ice, or would he just sink into the water? And I said, well, there's probably no ice in the summer and then ice in the winter. She said, no, I think there's ice year round. And she ended up being right. There is ice there year round. And so Santa could potentially have a house there, except the ice is always moving, so he'd have to keep his house on the move. But anyway, my kids really love the Santa myth. We are baking cookies, and we're going to set them out for Santa. And the kids know that daddy's going to eat them in the middle of the night. They know it, but they love it and they're into it, and we have fun. But I digress. Barrow is up there north, sort of by the North Pole, and it is on the coast of the Chukchi Sea. It lies 325 air miles north of Anchorage, so that crosses most of a huge portion of the state north-south. As of 2020, the population was 4,927, which is really amazing. That is a huge village, that many people. It is the 12th most populated city in Alaska, which I find amazing because it's so far up there, and yet so many people live there. And we'll get to why in a little bit. But a clue, it's oil. There are some archaeological sites in Barrow, and these are made up of 20 mounds, which are up to 14 feet tall, on beach ridges, and they come from the Burnurk culture. And this is part of the ancient history of the area. The mounds are said to be constructed from homes being built on top of older structures over hundreds of years of dwellers. The dwellings were constructed from driftwood and whale bones. They had sawed roof coverings and entrances that were lower than the floor of the dwelling to trap the heat inside during the cold winter months. So very clever designs there. They have found decorative ivories. They have found boat remains, toboggans, stone lamps. I don't know what stone lamps are, but it's listed there. Ceramic fragments, engraving tools, stone tools, slate tools, carved bone tools, harpoon parts, seal skins, caribou antler arrow points. That's awesome. And bow and arrow parts. Fishing lysters. I don't know what those are. Maybe I should look that up. But and they found some bird darts. I'm not sure what those are either. But point is, you obviously see some remains of people who lived there before. They date these sites presumably from carbon dating, although the website I was looking at did not say how they dated it, but presumably carbon dating from 500 to 900 AD. They say that the comparison of these artifacts and in the area of Barrow and the artifacts from the Russian Far East, so Eastern Siberia and Canada, show a strong cultural connection between these northerly peoples. And some other reading I've done, there seems to be a strong connection with people of Greenland, which is really interesting. The town of Barrow gets its name from a man named Sir John Barrow. He was the second secretary of the British Admiralty. Barrow started his position as the Admiralty in 1804, and he enjoyed this high position for 40 years, and he used his influence to promote Arctic exploration, including the voyages of John Ross, William Edward Parry, James Clark Ross, and John Franklin. I think that's from the famous Franklin expedition, which is a famous one because they believe that they engaged in cannibalism to survive up there in the Arctic North. And, these other names listed here, it'd be interesting to look them up and see what their voyages found up in the Arctic. Anyway, Barrow played a role in promoting these explorations. And so the name of the town of Barrow was in remembrance of Sir John Barrow. However, Barrow's, as a village, official name was changed to Utqiagvik. I had to practice saying this, Utqiagvik. Utqiagvik. I had to get it in my head to practice because I am not tuned into it. But it was changed to Utqiagvik, which I found a couple of different meanings for this. One website says Utqiagvik means the place where owls are hunted, but most websites said it is the place for gathering wild roots. The name change happened in 2016 in a part of the, quote, decolonization process and to support the use of the Inupiaq language. The vote went to the residents, which became controversial. But in the end, 381 voted for the name change and 375 voted against it. So the name change became official on October 6, 2016. So Not too long ago, it was changed. And I think that's why, I talk to people who go up there, who work the oil fields up there. They still call it Barrow. It's just part of the culture, but the official name is Utqiagvik. Opponents to the name change claimed that it would cost the community money because of the name recognition of Barrow by the tourism industry of the town. And so the debate went on, the tension between a modernizing world and a desire to preserve Alaska Native culture, which I find a really interesting debate. This day and age, I don't think there's really any major efforts that are intending to eradicate Native culture. But there is an obstacle to overcome, which, is just the impending massive English culture. So it takes work. It's going to take initiative and work to preserve the Native culture up there. And of course, the name change is one of those efforts, which I think is good. The way things used to be was a subsistence way of living. This still exists, but it's sort of a mix of modern imports with airplane and barges. And so they're not totally reliant on it, which changes the culture. And English is the dominant language now. The older languages are still around. There are still speakers. But really, English is the dominant language among all the Native peoples in Alaska. And so it will take hard work to preserve these cultures. So the question then is, how much will be preserved? I'm not really sure. There does seem to be in Alaska a general sense of sadness for the diminishment of Alaska Native culture. It is sort of an unspoken bitterness under a lot of the conversations I might have about the topic. So it can be complicated and difficult to navigate. But personally, I think the change of the name of this village is a good thing. And it's also very American, ironically, to name places after their historical locations. So, for example, I grew up in Illinois, and even the name Illinois is named after the Illini, which were a tribe that were there before I was. I went to public school. We were the Redskins was our name. And that's not a derogatory term. It was like the Redskins were tough people. We wanted to be Redskins because we were tough football players, and so I never thought of that as a derogatory thing, at least. And I think that's a good thing to keep the names or the original names of places. It's better and it's very American, I think. Another example is like changing the name of Mount McKinley to Mount Denali. President Obama did this during his term, and I think that's a really good move to use the original name Denali. This is the native name of the mountain. Even the name McKinley was named after an American president who never even visited Alaska. So the name, I hope it stays Denali. I think it's good to use these original names as a means of remembering our true past. So Alaska's never going to be the same as it used to be. It's going to become an American place. It has been for some time now, but it can be a very American thing to remember the history here, especially by naming the places after the native names, like in Barrow. Okay, let's see. I should move on. I digress. The modern history of Barrow, or Utqiagvik, begins in 1853 when Commander Rochfort Maguire of the Royal Navy explored the area, naming the place Utqiagvik. It later showed up in an 1855 map as Utqiagvik. I'm not sure what those words mean, but that is what showed up in these early maps from the first explorers. In 1881, a U.S. Army established a meteorological and magnetic research station near Barrow. Later in 1893, the Cape Smith Whaling and Trading Station, or also called Point Barrow Refuge Station, was constructed. Most notably, a historic building was constructed in 1889. So the story goes that American whalers began hunting this area in 1854 with a frequent loss of ships and life. On August 2nd, 1888, 30 whale ships anchored off Point Barrow to wait for the ice pack to open. And as they waited there, the winds picked up to gale forces and sending the ships crashing into one another. Luckily, a ship called the U.S. Revenue Cutter Bear, which you're going to hear about that boat later on, related to our next village, Beaver, so hang in there for that. Kind of cool. The U.S. Revenue Cutter Bear and the USS Thetis ships, I hope I pronounced those right, were nearby, and they rescued the ailing sailors. As a result of this near tragedy, fortunately no one died, the station was constructed on the site as a bunkhouse and a storage place for coal. A lot of the whalers could stop here and sleep and resupply, and this served there, I think it said, for 7 years as a bunkhouse. But the building was later adapted for use by the whaling company as a retail store and cafe. In 1980, it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places and is considered to be the oldest wood-framed building standing alongside Alaska's Arctic coast. So that's kind of a pretty neat little history tidbit there. This is transitioning here a bit. A Presbyterian church was established in Barrow in 1899, and most notably was a missionary named Dr. Henry W. Greist. He was a medical missionary, and he is credited for being head of the world's farthest north hospital and leading the Presbyterian Church in Barrow, Alaska. And he is known for his incredible stories as a medical doctor, and he's also known for hosting famed explorer Roald Amundsen, who I have read several books on, a very interesting figure in history. He was the first man to reach the South Pole. Also, he hosted in his home Charles Lindbergh on his journey up to Japan. He also hosted Will Rogers, who I don't think he actually met, but Will Rogers was on his way up to the village when he was killed. And I'll tell that story in a little bit. Now, there's a story about Dr. Henry W. Greist, about him being lost while he was journeying from Wainwright, which is a village just to the west of Barrow, and he got stuck in a blizzard in 60 below temperatures. During the blizzard, he wandered out into the frozen ocean ice, and after 3 days, he finally made his way back to safety in Barrow. And it's one of those memorable stories, and I found a newspaper clip from a 1936 Seattle Post newspaper, which tells that story. It was pretty cool. I love finding all these stories. They're just fascinating. There is an entire book about Dr. Henry W. Greist. I did save it on my wish list. And, it sounds like a fascinating story for Dr. Greist. Okay, some other notable people from Barrow, Alaska. One is a man named Andrew at Utqiagvik. Andrew at Utqiagvik. Andrew was a native man who was known as someone who loved his Bible and his people. He provided regular Bible studies for his people. He was educated, he was literate, and he was a strong advocate of education for the Eskimo. He was a strong believer in his people's ancestral rights to hunt and fish as they always had. He served as an interpreter for missionaries in Barrow in 1908. And then from 1936 to 1951, he held services for the scattered gatherings from Barrow to Demarcation Point. Tragically, however, Andrew at Utqiagvik was killed in a hunting accident in 1951 at just 60 years old. However, the churches that he started continued to meet in his home in the years following his death. Another notable figure in the history of missions in Barrow was a man named Percy Ipaluk. He was born on April 2nd, 1906. He was the first full-blooded Inupiaq Eskimo to be ordained, which was in 1951. He was educated at the University of Dubuque in Iowa, which apparently this university in Iowa was a very common place for Native people to go to be ordained, to be educated theologically, which is really interesting. And I think that had to do with Sheldon Jackson, the famous man who had played such a pivotal role in the history of missions in Alaska. He sent them to this university in Iowa. So he attended there, and he ended up serving as a lay preacher in Wainwright and Wales, which is relatively close to Barrow. Well, Wales is pretty far, but he served there until his ordination, after which he took charge of the church in Wainwright and even became a member of the Territorial House of Representatives in 1949. So he was involved in politics. He also served as an interpreter for Dr. Greist in Barrow. So that was another notable person who was born and raised in Barrow. Another interesting figure is Samuel Simmons. He was born in 1925 and grew up in the church in Barrow. He's often served as an interpreter for the missionaries there. But as he grew up, he drifted away from his faith that he was born into. But then in 1951, his wife was tragically killed in a plane crash. This tragedy led him back to the Lord and into the ministry. He ended up serving as the associate pastor of Barrow Church in 1961 until he served elsewhere, and he left in 1972. So another interesting figure of Barrow's history. Let's see. Another interesting tidbit in Barrow's history is that in 1946, the exploration of the Naval Petroleum Reserve Number 4, how's that for a name of an organization? It began in 1946, and it started to look for oil. When oil was found, the area completely changed. Almost literally money was just coming out of the ground. We joke that like money doesn't grow on trees. Well, it does apparently spew out of the ground in the form of oil, and lots of it in this area. The Naval Arctic Research Laboratory, the North Slope Bureau, and the Arctic Slope of Regional Corporation were developed in the following years because it was realized how much oil was there. The construction of the Prudhoe Bay oil fields and the Trans-Alaska Pipeline soon changed the economy of the entire state of Alaska. 95% of the oil in Alaska comes from this area. And in the year of 2024, this year, it produced an average of 466,600 barrels of oil per day. Now, as big as this number sounds, it's actually less than what it used to be. And there's a handful of articles debating whether it's going to go up or down in the future. So we'll see. It is the largest conventional oil field in North America. Now, I'm not sure what they mean by conventional oil field, because I've also read that Texas as a state does produce more oil than Alaska does. But it seems like the title for the most goes back and forth a little bit. The revenue from this area has become an economic giant for Alaska, accounting for 37.5% of Alaska's GDP, and it produces 85% of the revenue for the government of Alaska. There is no income tax in Alaska, which I enjoy, not having to pay that. It's also, Alaska's sort of famous for its PFDs. What does that stand for? Personal financial dividends, something like that. I don't remember. But the famous PFDs, it's every year the government gives Alaskan residents a cash money. And this comes from the oil revenues. Every year, it's like the politicians debate on how much the PFD ought to be. And of course, there's people on both sides of the aisle debating how much should this thing be. Some say a lot and some say a little. In the end, every Alaskan resident in October received their PFD. This year, it was $1,702 per person. And I first heard about this when I met someone from Alaska while I was in college in Chicago, and it almost made me angry. Like, I live in Illinois and I don't get money from the government. They only take it. But if you ever move to Alaska and you live here for at least, I think, 2 years, then you can get it. And there is actually some stories of people moving to Alaska just for that, and they try to live on it. But you can't live on $1,700 a year. All right. A few interesting things about Barrow. It has a seemingly out of place blue football field, which is called the Kathy Parker Field. I did not go down the bunny trail of finding out who Kathy Parker is, although that's something that I would usually do, but I didn't this time. It claims to be the northernmost football field in the Arctic Ocean. So there you go. If you play there, that's where you are, northernmost football field. So I found the wording a little bit odd. Does it imply that there are football fields further north, just not on the Arctic Ocean? Although the Arctic Ocean is the north. So I don't know. It's way up there though, and perhaps the most northerly football field, and it's blue. I don't know. I'm not sure why they built that, but they did, and it looks like it would be a lot of fun. Another notable feature in Barrow is the whalebone arch, which is often referred to as the gateway to the Arctic. The arch is made of a bowhead whale jawbone and seems to be considered a cultural icon for remembering the old ways of life in whaling by the Utqiagvik people. It is believed that the arch was constructed in the late 1800s. So this arch has been there, and these bones have been there for a surprisingly long time. If you Google Barrow, Alaska, one of the first images likely to come up is this arch. It's not very big, but if you consider that it's a whalebone, then you go, wow, it's huge. Some friends of mine have been to that arch before. All right. Another interesting thing about Barrow is I've been told by a few people that I know who work up there, they tell me that remains of palm trees have been dug up during their oil excavations in the area. So why palm trees are being dug up out of the ground in northern Alaska is a puzzle. But I've also read that mammoth remains have been found with tropical plants still in their belly undigested. Tropical plants that apparently these mammoths were eating. It's a little bit controversial, but it seems like most people agree the tropical plants have been found in their bellies. So if you ever look up weird things in Antarctica, one of the things you might find is that they are also finding tropical plant fossils in Antarctica. And so one of these days, I would enjoy going down that deep rabbit hole of why they're finding tropical plants in the Arctic regions of the world. Makes you wonder about the Earth's past, doesn't it? And so one of these days, that would be a fun rabbit hole to dive deep into. All right, that was some things about Barrow. Now I'm going to talk about the airport. I mentioned before a man named Will Rogers. Will Rogers was known as America's favorite cowboy philosopher. So why is the airport called the Wiley Post / Will Rogers Memorial Airport? Why that name? Will Rogers was a vaudeville performer, actor, and humorous social commentator. He made 71 films, wrote 4,000 newspaper columns, and he was extremely popular in the 1930s for his political wit, and he was the highest paid of all the Hollywood film stars at the time. So why is Will Rogers' name born on the airport of Barrow? That's what I wanted to know. Well, apparently Will Rogers began to fly across the country with mail carriers, making humorous commentaries about his adventures. He became a popular speaker advocating for victims of floods, droughts, and earthquakes across the country. Rogers, desiring to write a newspaper column about Alaska, and another man named Wiley Post, who was desiring to enhance American aviation, which was in competition with Europe aviation. The pair connected and decided to fly up to Alaska together. Now, Wiley Post, by attaching a Lockheed Explorer wing to a Lockheed Orion fuselage, and he slapped on some floats on there, the pair were ready for their journey north. They started in the state of Washington, and they hip-hopped their way all the way up to Fairbanks. And from Fairbanks, where they did a brief stay, they ended up heading north to Barrow, Alaska. The pair ended up crashing in a lagoon near Barrow, Alaska, and both men were killed on August 21st of 1935. And this is why the local airport in Barrow bears the name of this American legend, Wiley Post and Will Rogers. The airstrip is 7,100 feet long, so it's plenty long for most large aircraft to land on. It is a very well maintained paved runway at only 49 feet elevation, as it is very close to the coast. The airport has an ILS, localizer, RNAV, and VOR approaches. And of course, this is necessary in a place that is plagued by low visibility. They rely on this airport, and of course, they need all the proper equipment so planes can almost always get in and out. All right, I am at 30 minutes and I need to quicken up the pace here because I'm trying to keep these episodes concise. But we will end talking about Barrow with this. And I probably should call it Utqiagvik because that is its actual name right now. Utqiagvik. One of the most not puzzling, but like one of the most curious questions people want to know is how many days of darkness are actually there. A lot of people, when they think of Barrow, they think, oh, that's the place where it's dark for a really long time and the sun never rises. And yes, that is true. It is. I think I've heard of some movies based on this, and I'm not sure. I didn't look that up, but I haven't seen them. But there might be some movies based on this perpetual darkness. But I looked this up this year because when I Googled this, some said it's like 64 days a year, it's total darkness. Others said 65, others said 67. So I just looked on the official website for sunrises and sunsets for Barrow. And this year, the sun set in Barrow on November 18th at 1:30 p.m. And now today is, as I record, is December 23rd, 2024. So it has been dark there for over a month already. The sun set November 18th at 1:30 p.m. And the sun will not rise again until January 22nd at 1:13 p.m. in Barrow, Alaska. So this makes 65 continuous days without seeing the sun this year. Now, inversely, Barrow will experience around 80 days of continuous daylight in the summertime. So this may make up for, the lack of sun in the winter. Imagine 80 days or more of pure sunlight, never sets. Would be kind of cool. Maybe that's why they have that football field there. You can play, all day and all night, and the only thing stopping you is your own sleep. All right, let's move on to Beaver, Alaska. Beaver, Alaska. So while Barrow is quite large, the 12th largest town in Alaska, Beaver is pretty teeny tiny. But I enjoyed researching Beaver, Alaska. So Beaver, while it's really small, it is not small in heart. It is located on the north bank of the Yukon River. Beaver lies in a remote area, about 60 miles southwest of Fort Yukon. It is inside the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge. This area is claimed to be one of the highest nesting densities of waterfowl in North America. I thought that was pretty cool. The temperatures in Beaver range from -70 to positive 90 degrees. So that's a 160-degree temperature swing. Really amazing. Interestingly, the village is landlocked. The village itself is landlocked between the Yukon River and the airport. So if you look on Google Earth, you can see this. The airport kind of stretches across the length of the village because it's a very small village, and that kind of locks them into between that and the Yukon River. And according to some information I found, they say that there are no lands available for the village to grow, and this is like expressed as a frustration. But this may be why the village has declined in population lately. As of 2020, the population is 48 people, which is way down from 84, which was in 2010. The population was relatively steady since the first census there in 1930, which I think was about over 130 people. I don't remember. I remember seeing it though. So in other words, it's 48, which is down from 84. And even the 48 figure is 4 years old now. So I don't know what it is now. But the decline is notable. It's the greatest decline in Beaver's history. The vast majority of the residents are Native American. More specifically, they are mixed Gwich'in, Koyukon, Athabaskan, and interior Inupiaq peoples. So they kind of have mixed Native American people there. Residents are made up of people from surrounding villages such as Arctic Village, which we covered before, Veneti, Chalkisik. Did I pronounce that right? Chalkisik. Stevens Village, Rampart, White Eye, Fort Yukon, Barrow, and Huslia. So it's kind of a conglomerate of people from all these different places there in Beaver. Now, looking at some photos of Beaver that I found online, it looks like a very quiet place, but it screams in stunning beauty, especially in the summertime with the lush vegetation that kind of hugs the edges of the Yukon River. And I find this scenery to be just beautiful, be a lovely place to visit. But I have not been there. The history goes like this: gold discoveries were made in 1907 in the Chandalar River up to the north, which led to the founding of Beaver, Alaska. Beaver became a stop for gold seekers on their journey to the north. A trail was developed by the Alaska Road Commission from Beaver to Barrow on the Chandalar River because of the gold found there in 1907. In 1910, two men named Thomas Carter and H.E. Ashley established, these men recognized that there was economic opportunity, and they established a store there on the site of Beaver. Now, I spoke about this in previous episodes, specifically the one on the gold rush, but most people who made money during the gold rush were actually storekeepers and entrepreneurs rather than gold seekers. Very few people actually found enough gold to make the trip worth it, except for the experience. But the people who made really good money pretty consistently were the entrepreneurs, and these men were that sort. These insightful two men saw more possibility for profit in a store than in gold seeking. Also, 3 freight companies sprung up to help gold seekers transport their stuff up the trail, which later became known as Government Road. Only a few short years later, in 1911, the gold rush was over. The hype had died off, but the village of Beaver was not done. In 1911, a Japanese man named Frank Yasuda, he made his way to Beaver after conducting trades in Barrow and prospecting in the Brooks Range. Now, Frank Yasuda's story is interesting. I didn't dive too deep into it, but here's what I know. Frank was born in Japan, and he ended up on the very same boat that conducted a rescue mission that we just talked about in Barrow, which was the U.S. Revenue Cutter Bear, which brought him to Barrow, Alaska. Now, seeking a better life than Barrow had to offer for his family because of disease and hardship there, he came to Beaver with a group of Eskimos, and he became a partner in the trading post there. He served the remaining gold mines that lingered on beyond the end of the gold rush, supplying them by riverboat with firewood and engaging in fur trades with Eskimos in the region. And so his activity there in Beaver kind of established Beaver as a village. A post office was established in 1913. And whenever I say in these, a post office was established, that's usually when the government says, okay, that's a village, we need a post office. That's why when a post office shows up in a village, it's kind of a big deal. And so that happened in 1913 in Beaver. The first school was opened in 1928, an airstrip in the 1930s, and these helped keep the population stable up through the 70s, where I think in the 1980 census, there was like a little dip in the population, and then it came back up, and now in the last census, a huge dip, and I'm not sure exactly why. However, I was able to find some notes, which is from 2016, so a little bit old, 8 years old, from a tribal council, and they posted the meetings on the notes from this meeting on the internet, and I read through it. It was really helpful. On this tribal council meeting notes, they post a mission statement for the tribe or for the village, which was pretty cool. Here's the mission statement of Beaver, Alaska. It says, "We are a community of tribal people educated in a traditional and Western culture. We stand together to build capacity and provide sustainability for our tribe through economic development, the protection and preservation of our culture, traditions, and natural resources, to enhance the quality of life in our community through individual and family services, community programs, and partnership with other organizations to ensure the health and well-being of the community as a whole." So what a great mission statement for a village. And I read, there's a lot of good information in this document I found. It says that hunting, fishing, berry picking, and gardening are still popular activities in Beaver. Moose, salmon, freshwater fish, bear, and waterfowl supply meat for the residents. but the decline of salmon has made subsistence living more challenging for the residents. Beaver still participates in potlatches, spring carnivals, Christmas, and New Year's. They tell us that in these village notes that residents blend modern influences with a traditional way of life. There's no grocery store in Beaver. The residents, on top of their subsistence living, they have to order food from Fairbanks, which is delivered by a barge, which arrives twice during the summer by way of the Yukon River. And in the document, they complain it's expensive. And yes, I imagine it is. There is a school there called the Cruikshank School. It is K through 12. There are currently 2 teachers there, and there are 10 students. And the school has a Gwich'in language program. There are no roads to Beaver, making the local gravel airstrip an important part of the community. In times past, people traveled to Beaver via dog sled, but this declined because of fishing restrictions. It's interesting, dog sledding and fishing restrictions connected in that way. ATVs and snow machines are still very widely used in the village. So it's also important to note that you do not want to break your leg or get any kind of injury in Beaver. There's like no medical help out there. You have to be flown out to Fairbanks. All right, according to this document, it says there are 2 churches in Beaver. And so I thought, well, what are these churches? And so I Googled it. I did find 2 churches, one called St. Matthew's Episcopal Church and Noatak Friends Church. Now, these show up on a Google search. There's no information about them. However, I did find, I have some unique resources and I have access to some interesting history of some of the missionaries who served in Beaver, Alaska. There was a man named Paul Bills and his wife, Marguerite. They were Assemblies of God missionaries from New Jersey. Now, from New Jersey, they drove all the way up to Alaska and they ended up in North Pole. While living in North Pole, they adopted 2 native girls named Marcis and Roxanne. And then later they had a son named Paul. Meanwhile, another missionary, Walt Lyons, started the Open Door Bible Church in Beaver. Now, I could not find any other information about this church. The information is surprisingly scant. But regardless, Paul and Marguerite took over for him in Beaver, where they reportedly struggled as the family lived in just a 2-room dirt roof cabin. When asking the locals where they got their water, they pointed to the Yukon River and said, "There's lots of water over there." But the Yukon was frozen. So realizing he was a bit in over his head, Paul reports that it was a huge struggle for him to get water, and he never thought of water as such a precious resource before that. Paul and his family later moved to Barrow and then later to Nome, and Paul eventually died in 1956 of Lou Gehrig's disease, and he was buried next to his close friend named Ned Nusungin. That's hard to pronounce. Nusungina. Ned Nusungina, a native man who became one of his closest friends and interpreter from his time in Barrow. So that was an interesting story of someone who served there in Beaver, Alaska. Now, one thing I could not find about beaver was why it's called beaver. I love beavers as an animal. It's like one of the biggest rodents. I think it's in the rodent family. And I've always loved our tree nibbling friends. But I have not found anywhere why it's called beaver. But presumably there's beavers in the area and someone saw one and they said, let's call it beaver. I don't know, but I like the name. All right, well, that's all I have for the villages of Barrow, or I should say Utqiagvik and Beaver, Alaska. I do want to wish all of you a very Merry Christmas. I'm really glad I was able to squeeze in this episode right before the Christmas season. I hopefully will record again next Monday, but then I will be going on vacation. So I should get a recording in next week. And then after that, you probably won't hear from me for a little bit because I am going on vacation to see some family in the lower 48. Now, during this Christmas season, we are having our first Christmas in Alaska every year prior to this, we've always left to see family. And this year we said, no, we're not going anywhere. And so we've been really enjoying being more homebodies, and we're doing Advent with my kids. We're counting down the days. My own daughter said, we have 2 days left, Daddy, till Christmas. So from our family to yours, we wish you a very Merry Christmas. Next week, we will be doing the next 2 villages, which will be Belkovsky and Bethel. So Belkovsky and Bethel are both in southwestern Alaska. Bethel being a huge, larger village, a hub village, and I've been to many times. So we will be tackling those 2 next time. Thank you for tuning in, y'all. So apologies for the longer episode, but there was so much to talk about of Barrow or Utqiagvik. So thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you next time on Tell Your Story, Alaska.